A single man's no averted nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. The D-Day landings, the largest amphibious invasion in history, were almost cancelled because of a weather forecast. An East German bureaucrat accidentally told the world the Berlin Wall was open, effective immediately, triggering its collapse hours later. History is full of these knife-edge moments where colossal events could have easily swerved in a completely different direction or not occurred at all. Here are 13 such instances where the course of human events hung by the thinnest of threads. Number 13. The battle that turned the Pacific War almost didn't go America's way. The Battle of Midway in June 1942 is often called the turning point of the war in the Pacific. But America's stunning victory against the much more experienced Japanese fleet was a combination of brilliant code-breaking, incredible luck, and Japanese missteps that almost didn't line up. American cryptanalysts had partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25B. They suspected a major Japanese operation was targeting a location codenamed AF. To confirm if AF was Midway Atoll, the U.S. defenders there sent a false unencrypted message claiming Midway was short of fresh water. Soon after, American codebreakers intercepted a Japanese message stating that AF was indeed short of water. The trap was set. Yet even knowing the target, the Americans were still outnumbered. On the morning of June 4th, Japanese scout planes were delayed in launching. Crucially, the scout plane assigned to search the sector where the American carriers were eventually found had engine trouble, taking off 30 minutes late. When it finally spotted the American fleet, its report was slow to reach Admiral Nagumo, the Japanese commander. Nagumo, initially believing no American carriers were nearby, had ordered his planes, which had just attacked Midway Island, to be rearmed with bombs for a second island strike. When the American carriers were finally reported, he had to make a fateful decision: launch his planes armed with bombs against ships, or rearm them again with torpedoes, a time-consuming process that would leave his carriers vulnerable with decks full of fuel lines and ordnance. He chose to rearm. It was during this chaotic, vulnerable window with Japanese planes crowded on hangar decks and flight decks that American dive bombers themselves arriving separately and by chance after their torpedo bomber colleagues had been annihilated, struck. 3 Japanese carriers were hit almost simultaneously and turned into blazing infernos within minutes. A 4th was crippled later that day. Had that scout plane launched on time, or its report been quicker, or the American dive bombers arrived 30 minutes earlier or later, the Japanese fleet might have been prepared, and the outcome of the battle, and perhaps the war in the Pacific, could have been vastly different. Number 12. The briefcase bomb that almost ended Hitler early. On July 20th, 1944, Colonel Claus von Stauffenberg walked into Adolf Hitler's Wolf's Lair headquarters in East Prussia with a bomb in his briefcase. This was the culmination of a long brewing plot by disillusioned German military officers to assassinate Hitler and overthrow the Nazi regime. Stauffenberg, who had lost an eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand in North Africa, was a key figure. He was scheduled to brief Hitler. Plan was for him to place the briefcase with the bomb as close to Hitler as possible, make an excuse to leave, and then fly to Berlin to initiate a coup. However, several things went wrong that day, ultimately saving Hitler's life. Due to the summer heat, the meeting was moved from Hitler's usual underground bunker, which would have contained the blast, to a larger wooden conference hut with open windows, which dissipated much of the bomb's force. Critically, Stauffenberg only managed to arm one of the 2 explosive charges he had brought. Rushed and interrupted while trying to arm the second device with his 3 remaining fingers, he had to abandon it. This halved the bomb's potential power. Once in the conference room, Stauffenberg placed the briefcase under the large oak map table, near Hitler. Shortly before the bomb detonated, another officer, Colonel Heinz Brandt, wanting a better view of the map, found the briefcase in his way and moved it further under the table to the other side of a thick wooden table support. This heavy table leg inadvertently shielded Hitler from the main force of the explosion. When the bomb went off, 4 people were killed and many injured, but Hitler survived with only minor injuries, including burst eardrums and splinters. Stauffenberg, seeing the explosion, assumed Hitler was dead and flew to Berlin. But the coup Operation Valkyrie faltered when news of Hitler's survival spread. Plotters were rounded up and executed. A slightly different placement of the briefcase, or the second charge being armed, could have changed the leadership of Germany and potentially shortened World War II. Number 11. The Gunpowder Plot that almost decapitated English royalty. Remember the 5th of November. This famous rhyme commemorates the foiling of the Gunpowder Plot in 1605, a conspiracy by a group of provincial English Catholics to assassinate King James I of England and VI of Scotland, his family, and most of the Protestant aristocracy by blowing up the Houses of Parliament during the state opening. Plotters, led by Robert Catesby, hoped to ignite a Catholic uprising. They had managed to smuggle 36 barrels of gunpowder into a cellar beneath the House of Lords, enough to completely obliterate the building and everyone in it. The plan was meticulously prepared, and Guy Fawkes, an explosives expert, was tasked with igniting the fuse. The entire plot, however, was undone by a single, anonymous letter. About 10 days before the planned explosion, Lord Monteagle, a Catholic peer, received a warning letter urging him to stay away from Parliament on November 5th. The letter was vague but alarming enough for Monteagle to take it to Robert Cecil, Earl of Salisbury, the King's chief minister. The origins of the letter remain a mystery, with some suspecting one of the conspirators themselves, perhaps Francis Tresham, Monteagle's brother-in-law, trying to save him. Initially, some privy councillors thought it might be a hoax, but King James, upon reading it, reportedly fixated on the phrase, "a terrible blow," and suspected something involving gunpowder. An initial search of the cellars under Parliament on November 4th revealed nothing unusual, just a large pile of firewood in a rented undercroft, which concealed the gunpowder barrels, tended by a man calling himself John Johnson, Guy Fawkes. It was only during a second, more thorough search, very late that night, prompted by the king's lingering suspicion that Fawkes was discovered with fuses and matches in his possession, and the gunpowder barrels were found. Had that letter never been sent, or if it had been dismissed, English history would have recorded a very different and much more violent. November 5th. Number 10. The Apollo 13 mission that almost didn't make it home. Houston, we've had a problem. These understated words, spoken by astronaut Jack Swigert on April 13, 1970, signaled the start of one of the most harrowing and ingeniously managed survival sagas in space exploration history. Apollo 13 was NASA's third mission, intended to land humans on the moon. But 56 hours into the flight, and over 200,000 miles from Earth, an oxygen tank in the service module exploded. The explosion crippled the spacecraft, depriving the command module, CM, named Odyssey, of most of its oxygen, electricity, light, and water. The lunar landing was instantly aborted. The new mission was simply to get astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes home alive. The odds were stacked against them. They had to use the lunar module, LM, Aquarius, designed to support 2 astronauts on the moon for 2 days, as a lifeboat for 3 men for nearly 4 days. The challenges were immense and numerous. Engineers at Mission Control in Houston worked around the clock, improvising solutions. One critical problem was removing carbon dioxide from the LM's atmosphere. The LM's CO2 scrubbers were overwhelmed. The CN had spare CO2 absorbent canisters, but they were square, and the LM's system used round canisters. Engineers on the ground famously devised a way to fit a square peg in a round hole, using only materials available to the astronauts on board: plastic bags, cardboard, and duct tape. Another near disaster was navigating the crippled spacecraft. Without their primary guidance system, the astronauts had to perform a crucial course correction burn manually, using the sun as an alignment point. Power was so low that the CM was shut down completely, leading to freezing temperatures inside. The re-entry itself was fraught with uncertainty, as no one knew if the heat shield had been damaged in the explosion. Against all these odds, the patched-up spacecraft and its exhausted crew successfully re-entered Earth's atmosphere and splashed down safely in the Pacific Ocean on April 17th. Countless small failures could have doomed them. Instead, countless small successes and incredible teamwork brought them home. Number 9. The Wright Brothers flight that almost stayed grounded. For centuries, humans dreamed of flying. By the turn of the 20th century, many inventors and daredevils had tried and failed, often spectacularly and sometimes fatally. So when Orville and Wilbur Wright, two bicycle mechanics from Dayton, Ohio, achieved the first successful sustained flight of a powered, heavier-than-air aircraft on December 17, 1903, it was a monumental achievement. But it was an achievement that almost didn't happen, or at least not on that day and not by them. The Wrights were meticulous. They spent years studying aerodynamics, building and testing gliders, and designing their own lightweight engine and efficient propellers. Even so, their path to that first flight at Kitty Hawk, North Carolina, was filled with setbacks. Their 1901 and 1902 gliders hadn't performed as well as their calculations predicted, forcing them to build their own wind tunnel and re-evaluate existing aerodynamic data. When they were finally ready with their powered Wright Flyer in late 1903, they faced more challenges. Their first attempt at powered flight on December 14th, with Wilbur at the controls after winning a coin toss, ended in a minor crash after stalling on takeoff. Repairs took 3 days. On the morning of December 17th, the conditions were far from ideal. A biting cold wind was blowing at over 20 miles per hour. It was Orville's turn. He lay prone at the controls, and at 10:35, and the flyer lifted off. It traveled 120 feet in 12 seconds. It wasn't much, but it was true. Sustained, controlled flight. They made 3 more flights that day, the longest covering 852 feet in 59 seconds, piloted by Wilbur Bayer. After that 4th flight, a strong gust of wind caught the parked flyer, flipping it over and damaging it beyond immediate repair. Had they given up after the first crash, or if the wind had been too strong or too weak that day, or if their custom-built engine had failed just one more time, it had its own share of problems during development. That historic first flight might have been delayed or achieved by someone else entirely. The age of aviation teetered on the patience and persistence of 2 brothers on a windy beach. Number 8. Columbus's voyage that almost turned back in mutiny. Christopher Columbus's 1492 voyage across the Atlantic, seeking a westward route to the Indies, fundamentally changed the world. But this epical journey was incredibly close to failing before it ever reached the Americas. Columbus set sail from Palos, Spain, on August 3, 1492, with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. He had drastically underestimated the Earth's circumference, and therefore the distance to Asia. As weeks turned into months with no sight of land, the crews grew increasingly restless, fearful, and mutinous. They were sailing into uncharted waters, further from land than any European sailors had dared before, with dwindling provisions and growing doubts about Columbus's calculations and sanity. By early October, after more than 2 months at sea, the situation was critical. Sailors openly spoke of turning back, and some even whispered of throwing Columbus overboard. On October 10th, the grumbling reached a boiling point. According to some accounts, Columbus struck a deal with the increasingly desperate captains of the Pinta and Nina, Martin Alonso Pinzon and Vicente Yanes Pinzon. If land was not sighted within 3 days, they would turn back to Spain. Other accounts suggest he simply bluffed and bullied his way through, promising riches and appealing to their honor. Whatever the exact details, the expedition was on the brink. Then, just 2 days later, in the early hours of October 12th, 1492, a lookout on the Pinta, Rodrigo de Triana, also known as Juan Rodriguez Bermejo, shouted, "Tierra, tierra, land, land." They had reached an island in the Bahamas. Had land not appeared for just a few more days, the pressure from the crew likely would have become irresistible. Columbus would have been forced to abandon his quest, and the discovery of the Americas by Europeans, at least at that moment and by that expedition, would not have happened. The course of global history hinged on those few extra days of perseverance, or perhaps desperation. Number 7. The man who disobeyed orders and may have prevented World War II. In the early hours of September 26, 1983, Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov was the duty officer at Serpukhov, 15, a secret Soviet command center south of Moscow. His job was to monitor Oko, the Soviet Union's early warning satellite system, for any signs of an American nuclear missile launch. Cold War was at a particularly tense point. Just 3 weeks earlier, the Soviets had shot down a Korean Airlines passenger jet, KAL-7, that had strayed into their airspace, kill aboard, including a U.S. congressman. Retaliation fears were high on both sides. Suddenly, the alarms blared. The system reported that a single intercontinental ballistic missile had been launched from the United States and was heading towards the Soviet Union. Then another, and another, until the system indicated 5 missiles were incoming. Soviet military protocol was clear. Any such launch detection was to be immediately reported up the chain of command to General Secretary Yuri Andropov. This would almost certainly trigger a massive, retaliatory Soviet nuclear strike based on the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. But Petrov hesitated. He had a gut feeling something was wrong. The new satellite system was known to have glitches. An attack involving only 5 missiles seemed illogical for a first strike. He expected an all-out salvo. His computer screens read Elinch in stark red letters. His subordinates were panicking. Pressure to report was immense. Yet, Petrov, trusting his intuition and technical knowledge over the computer system and protocol, reported it to his superiors as a system malfunction. He reasoned that if the U.S. were to attack, they would do so with hundreds of missiles, not just a handful. He was right. Later investigations revealed that the false alarm was caused by a rare alignment of sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds and the Monia orbits of the satellites. Had Petrov followed protocol, or been a less thoughtful or more trigger-happy officer, the world might have plunged into a full-scale nuclear war. His decision to disobey was an act of incredible personal courage that went largely unrecognized for years. Number 6. The fog that saved the American Revolution. In August 1776, just a month after the Declaration of Independence was signed, the fledgling American Revolution faced what could have been a swift and decisive end. General George Washington's Continental Army was soundly defeated by a much larger and more professional British force under General William Howe at the Battle of Long Island, also known as the Battle of Brooklyn. The Americans were outmaneuvered, outfought, and suffered heavy casualties. Washington and the remainder of his battered army, around 9,000 men, found themselves trapped against the East River in Brooklyn Heights, with the British Army in front of them and the formidable Royal Navy potentially blocking any escape by water. Capture or annihilation seemed imminent. General Howe, perhaps overly cautious or confident of Washington's entrapment, decided against a risky frontal assault on the American fortifications, opting instead to prepare for a siege. This pause gave Washington a slim chance. On the night of August 29–30, under the cover of darkness, Washington organized a daring and desperate evacuation of his entire army across the East River to Manhattan. He commandeered every available boat, rowed by rugged Massachusetts fishermen and sailors from Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Regiment. The operation was fraught with peril. The river was treacherous, and British warships could have easily intercepted them. For hours, the evacuation proceeded in eerie silence, with wagon wheels muffled and orders given in whispers. But as dawn approached, a significant portion of the army was still on the Brooklyn side, vulnerable to discovery and attack. Then, something extraordinary happened. A dense fog rolled in, settling over the area and obscuring the American retreat from British eyes well into the morning. This heaven-sent fog, as some called it, allowed the last of the troops and critical supplies to be ferried across to safety. By the time the fog lifted and the British advanced, they found the American positions empty. Washington's army had vanished. Had that fog not appeared, or had Howe been more aggressive, the Continental Army might have been destroyed, its commander captured, and the American Revolution potentially crushed in its infancy. Number 5. The wrong turn that sparked a world war. World War I, a conflict that redrew maps, toppled empires, and cost millions of lives, was ignited by a single event: the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary in Sarajevo on June 28, 1914. But the assassination itself was a remarkably haphazard affair, succeeding largely due to a series of blunders and one incredibly fateful wrong turn. A group of young Serbian nationalists, known as the Black Hand, had plotted to kill the Archduke during his visit to Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia, then a province of Austria-Hungary. Their initial attempts that morning were a comical failure. The first conspirator along the motorcade route lost his nerve and didn't act. The second, Nedeljo Kabrnevic, threw a bomb at the Archduke's car, but it bounced off the folded-back convertible roof and exploded under the following car, injuring several people but leaving Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie unharmed. Kabrnevic swallowed a cyanide pill which only made him sick, and jumped into the Miljacka River, which was only a few inches deep, ensuring his capture. The remaining assassins, disheartened, dispersed. Franz Ferdinand, shaken but determined, decided to continue with his planned visit to the town hall. After the official reception, he insisted on visiting the injured from the bombing in the hospital. The officials, however, forgot to tell the Archduke's driver, Leopold Loja, that the route had been changed to avoid the city center where the earlier assassins had been. So, Lojka took a wrong turn onto Franz Joseph Street, following the original, now dangerous route. Realizing the mistake, General Oskar Potiorek, the governor of Bosnia, shouted at the driver to stop and turn around. Lojka braked and began to slowly reverse the open-topped car. By sheer tragic coincidence, one of the would-be assassins' 19-year-old Gavrilo Princip had gone to a nearby delicatessen after the failed bombing. As he emerged, he found the Archduke's car stopped just a few feet away from him, struggling to turn. Princip seized his chance, stepped forward and fired 2 shots from his pistol, hitting Franz Ferdinand in the neck and Sophie in the abdomen. Both died shortly after. Had the driver not taken that wrong turn, or had Princip chosen a different cafe, the assassination that directly triggered the July crisis and then World War I might never have happened. The fate of millions hung on a driver's error and an assassin's lucky possessioning. Number 4. The moldy sandwich that gave us penicillin. The discovery of penicillin, the world's first mass-produced antibiotic, revolutionized medicine and saved countless millions of lives. Yet this groundbreaking discovery by Scottish scientist Alexander Fleming in 1928 was almost entirely accidental, a product of untidiness, a forgotten experiment, and a fortunate contamination. Fleming was a bacteriologist at St. Mary's Hospital in London, known for his brilliant research, but also for his notoriously messy laboratory. Before going on a month-long summer holiday in August 1928, he had been cultivating Staphylococcus bacteria in Petri dishes. He left a stack of these dishes on a bench in a corner of his lab, some of which were not properly stored or were inadvertently left uncovered. When Fleming returned in September, he began sorting through the old cultures. He noticed something unusual in one dish that had been contaminated with a blue-green mold, Penicillium notatum. Around the mold, the colonies of Staphylococcus had been destroyed. Further away, they were normal. Fleming realized that the mold must be producing a substance that was killing the bacteria. He famously said, "That's funny." He isolated the mold, grew it in pure culture, and found that it produced a substance that killed many common disease-causing bacteria. Called this substance penicillin. However, Fleming struggled to isolate and stabilize the active penicillin compound, and his initial findings were largely ignored by the scientific community for over a decade. It wasn't until World War II, when Howard Florey, Ernst Chain, and their team at Oxford University picked up Fleming's research and developed methods for mass production, that penicillin's true life-saving potential was unleashed. Had Fleming been a tidier scientist and discarded his contaminated cultures before his holiday, or had that specific mold spore not wafted in through an open window and landed on that particular Petri dish, the discovery of this miracle drug could have been delayed for years. Number 3. The botched announcement that brought down the Berlin Wall. The fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9, 1989 was a pivotal moment, signaling the end of the Cold War and the reunification of Germany. But this iconic event, celebrated by images of euphoric crowds dismantling the wall, was triggered not by a carefully planned political decision, but by a confused, poorly prepared East German official at a routine press conference. East Germany was facing mounting pressure from mass protests and a flood of its citizens immigrating via Hungary and Czechoslovakia. The ruling Socialist Unity Party, SED, was desperately trying to manage the situation. On the evening of November 9th, Günter Schabowski, a member of the SED Politburo and its spokesman, was scheduled to hold a press conference to announce new relaxed travel regulations. He had been handed a note about the new rules just before the conference, but hadn't had time to read it thoroughly. Towards the end of the press conference, an Italian journalist asked when the new regulations would come into effect. Schabowski, shuffling through his papers, looked flustered. He read out a vaguely worded section of the document, stating that East Germans could now apply for visas to travel or emigrate abroad, and that these would be granted quickly. Then came the crucial part. When pressed further by journalists about when this would take effect, Schabowski, clearly unsure and having missed a detail in his notes that the rules were meant to be enacted the following day, with specific procedures for application, improvised. He famously stated, "As far as I know, that is immediately, without delay." News of Schabowski's statement spread like wildfire through West German television and radio, which many East Berliners could receive. Thousands of East Berliners flocked to the border crossings along the Berlin Wall, demanding to be let through. The overwhelmed and confused border guards, who had received no official orders, tried to contact their superiors, but received no clear instructions on how to handle the massive crowds. Faced with the sheer number of people and the potential for violence, some guards at certain checkpoints like Bornholm or Strasse eventually decided on their own initiative to open the gates. The dam had broken. Had Przybylski been better briefed, or had he not uttered the word "Sopo" immediately, or had the border guards held firm, that historic night might have unfolded very differently, perhaps more slowly, or even violently. Number 2. The stormy weather that almost stopped D. The Allied invasion of Normandy on June 6, 1944, known as D-Day, was the largest amphibious invasion in history and a crucial turning point in World War II, opening a second front in Western Europe against Nazi Germany. The massive operation, codenamed Overlord, involved meticulous planning, immense resources, and extraordinary bravery. Yet, it was almost derailed by something entirely out of human control: the weather. The invasion had been originally scheduled for June 5th, but atrocious weather conditions, high winds, heavy rain, and rough seas in the English Channel forced General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, to make a difficult postponement. Conditions were so bad that German Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, commanding German defenses in Normandy, felt confident enough to leave his post for Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday and try to meet with Hitler, believing no invasion was possible in such weather. The decision to launch on June 6th hung precariously on a narrow window of slightly improved but still marginal weather forecast by Allied meteorologists, particularly Group Captain James Stagg. Stagg predicted a brief respite in the storm, a small gap of better weather that would allow the invasion to proceed. It was a huge gamble. If the forecast was wrong, the entire Allied armada, with hundreds of thousands of men and tens of thousands of vehicles, could be caught in a devastating storm, leading to catastrophic losses and mission failure. Eisenhower faced an agonizing choice. Delaying further would mean waiting at least 2 weeks for the right combination of tide and moonlight, potentially losing the element of surprise and risking the discovery of the vast invasion force assembled in England. On the evening of June 4th, after much deliberation and conflicting advice, Eisenhower listened to Stagg's cautiously optimistic forecast for a temporary break in the weather on June 6th. He famously said, "Okay, we'll go." Even then, the weather on D-Day itself was far from ideal. Choppy seas swamped many landing craft, and overcast skies hampered air support. Had Stagg's forecast been slightly more pessimistic, or had Eisenhower decided the risk was too great, D-Day would have been postponed again, potentially for weeks or even months. The absence of Rommel from the front lines on June 6th, due to his belief the weather made an invasion impossible, also played a role in the initial, albeit chaotic, success of the Allied landings. The fate of the war in Europe truly hung on a weather report and a commander's nerve. Number 1. The submarine officer who said no to nuclear war. During the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, the world stood on the absolute brink of nuclear annihilation. As American and Soviet leaders engaged in a high-stakes standoff over Soviet missiles deployed in Cuba, a terrifyingly close call occurred deep beneath the waves of the Atlantic, an incident that remained secret for decades. A Soviet Foxtrot-class submarine B-59, part of a flotilla of 4 sent to Cuba, was detected by the U.S. Navy near its quarantine line around the island. The U.S. forces, unaware that these submarines were armed with nuclear torpedoes, each with a yield comparable to the Hiroshima bomb, began dropping practice depth charges intended to force the submarine to surface for identification. The crew of B-59, however, had been out of radio contact with Moscow for days. Due to the depth they were running at to avoid detection, they were hot, exhausted, and had no idea if war had already broken out on the surface. The depth charges exploding around them were terrifying. Captain of B-59 Valentin Savitsky reportedly believed that war had indeed begun and decided to launch their nuclear torpedo. He shouted, "We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy. Under Soviet Naval Protocol, at the time the decision to launch a nuclear torpedo required the unanimous consent of 3 officers on board: the captain, the political officer Ivan Maslenikov, and the flotilla commodore, or second-in-command if the commodore was not on that petameter, who happened to be on B-59 Vasily Arkhipov. Both Captain Savitsky and political officer Maslenikov reportedly agreed to launch, but Vasily Arkhipov disagreed. Arkhipov, who was also Chief of Staff of the Submarine Brigade and technically equal in rank to Savitsky, though Savitsky was captain of that specific sub, argued against the launch. He reasoned that the Americans were likely trying to make them surface, not destroy them, as the depth charges were not direct hits. He calmed Savitsky down and persuaded him to surface and await orders from Moscow. Accounts of the exact exchange vary, but the outcome is clear. Arkhipov's refusal to authorize the launch prevented it. Had Arkhipov not been present, or had he agreed with the other 2 officers, under the immense pressure and fear of that moment, B-59 would have launched its nuclear torpedo. Such an attack on the U.S. Navy would have almost certainly triggered a full-scale nuclear retaliation from the United States, leading to a global thermonuclear war. One man in the sweltering, claustrophobic confines of a submerged submarine made a decision that very likely saved the world.